Hannah Ryan comes to us from UVA Wise in Southwest Virginia with an eye on the long game. We continue to be tossed and thrown by the curveballs coming our way. Dr. Ryan invites us to hold on to what is most important for our singers in paint samples, focusing on our goals to thrive in COVID-19. Voices United is happy to welcome Hannah Ryan.
Hi everyone, my name is Hannah Ryan, and I am excited to be talking to you today about paint samples, using our goals to thrive during COVID-19. This whole idea came about from a discussion with a colleague a few months ago. She and I were talking about all of the new ways and new strategies to adapt to this rapidly changing world, and how essentially no ideas are bad ideas. It's just a matter of taking them home and seeing how they work for us and our ensembles, like paint samples. You can't really know how it works until you get it into your own space. But there are so many good ideas out there. There are so many paint samples. It's easy to get overwhelmed and maybe a little bit burnt out. So today, we're going to be talking about using our goals to find paint samples that will work for us. And we're specifically going to be talking about how to set goals. How to set goals that will be specific and achievable and relevant so that we can use our time wisely and thrive during COVID-19. So this is paint samples using goals to guide us in COVID-19. So I'll start by stating the obvious. The future is uncertain for each and every one of us, and we face a very different future. Some of us might be planning to be online. Some of us might be planning to be face-to-face. Many of us might be expecting to be hybrid. But of course, any of those might change. We might expect to be face-to-face and have to move online at a moment's notice. And regardless, our ensembles are going to look different than they have. We won't be singing together like we're used to for maybe a long time. Now, we're still teachers, we're still directors and musicians, and we want to achieve things with our students. We want to have a successful semester and year. But we need new ideas in order to figure out what strategies are going to work for us. So this is the idea of paint samples. No idea is a bad idea. Right now, we will hopefully have a plethora of ideas between conferences and colleagues and various Facebook groups. We are going to have so many different strategies and new techniques that we're able to try. But the challenge is we have so many different strategies and techniques that we're able to try. How do we know where to start? It's like being at a hardware store and you see the entire array of the rainbow of colors in front of you. If you don't have an idea of what room you're trying to paint, what aesthetic you're trying to create in that room, it can be really overwhelming. So how do we focus our efforts and not get burned out? How do we learn even to narrow it down so that we have the right shade or the right hue for paint samples for all of these different techniques that we can start to try for the fall? Well, the idea is that we refocus our efforts by creating new, effective, specific, and achievable goals. And by using these goals, we are able to narrow down our focus and take home paint samples and still see if they work for us, if they help us to achieve those goals, but hopefully to work more effectively rather than getting overwhelmed. So the way we do that is setting goals. So we're talking about goal setting theory, which has been developed essentially by Latham and Locke. If you've ever been in the corporate world, then you're very familiar with this. It's a popular topic in leadership. But the idea is by setting goals, specific goals, certain types of goals, you can increase motivation, you can increase productivity, and self-satisfaction. So what is a goal? According to Latham and Locke, whose fine pictures you see here, it is the aim of an action to attain a specific standard of proficiency, usually within a specified time limit. So they developed goal-setting theory. It's based on the idea that conscious goals will affect action. So essentially, their research showed that specific, challenging goals linked with feedback will contribute to higher and better task performance. So goals are going to affect our motivation and our achievement. It's important as we set goals for ourselves and our students. We're sharing these goals with our students. Obviously, we don't share every single goal that we have for our students, but we'll talk later about how that's important for their motivation as well as their commitment. And further, the more difficult a valued goal is, the more intense our efforts will be to attain it, and the more success we experience following achievement. Now, this is, of course, a balance. We can't choose a goal that is too challenging, or else we will be overwhelmed and frustrated. But if you manage to achieve this balance, it increases performance. Finally, and this is important, I think, for this fall, goals affect our perceived control over goal outcomes and our future. So if you're anything like me, this spring caught me by surprise. I definitely felt like I was on my heels for most of it, being very reactive, and certainly had no control over what was going on. So ideally, by setting goals that are specific and achievable, we can help ourselves feel like we are exerting as much positive control as we can. Now, certainly with the caveat that we all know that we can't control everything, certainly not this fall, but at least gives us some idea of being proactive rather than reactive. This quote from Locke really struck me. Every person's life depends on the process of choosing goals to pursue. If you remain passive, you are not going to thrive as a human being. I did not feel proactive this spring, and I certainly did not feel like I was thriving. So hopefully, intentionally setting goals can help us all feel like we're thriving this fall. So, Locke and Latham came up with 5 aspects of successful goal setting. These are commitment, clarity, challenging, task complexity, and feedback. So let's go through each of these one by one. So the first is commitment. Essentially, the amount of commitment we have for a goal will determine its success. This is going to be fed into by a lot of the other aspects like clarity and challenge and task complexity. But the commitment is a really important aspect of achieving goals. And that's going to be both for ourselves and for our students. So a way to not necessarily create commitment is we dictate goals for our students. We're learning 10 pieces this fall. These are the pieces. Go. Now, some of our students, that'll work fine for them. Our goals are their goals. Our commitment is their commitment. But generally, a better way to gain commitment with our students is we work to identify our goals with our students. Now, to a point, we are teachers, not just leaders on a corporate team. And so, of course, we are guiding these goals. I'm not going to let my students decide that their goal for this fall is to learn a Kanye West song and only a Kanye West song or a Taylor Swift song and nothing else. We work to identify these goals and we help to manage what these goals might be. But by working on these goals with our students, by helping them to relate to these goals, we can increase their commitment. It's important that we and our students identify and agree that goals are realistic, relevant, and desired. I think we've all certainly worked on projects that we might not have found relevant to our lives or realistic goals, and certainly desire will affect our commitment. we won't work as hard for something that we don't necessarily desire the outcome. So talking with our students is really important. Allowing them to identify and collaborate with us on the goals that we have set for this fall. Even if I don't give my students an overwhelming amount of input on the goal, generally I always make sure that we are on board, especially when we get to a challenging time. In a rehearsal, I will say to my students, we need to have these notes learned by next week so that we can start working on other things, so we can start working on diction. Is that something we can do? Is that something you guys feel like is possible? And they generally, when faced with that challenge and the option to rise to it, they almost always agree, yes, we can do that. We can make that happen. And in that way, they have related to this goal. It's a goal that they have come to themselves as well. And so it increases that commitment. Clarity. So you are probably familiar with the idea of SMART goal setting, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But really, to be motivating, goals must be clear. So if a goal is unclear, the path toward achieving it is also going to be unclear. And if we don't understand how to achieve something, we aren't going to be very committed to achieving it, and we aren't going to be very motivated to achieve it. So for instance, we set the goal, we're going to sing this piece memorized at concert. Okay, well that's a big goal. It's not super clear how we're going to get there. That path toward success isn't understood. A more clear goal might be, today we're going to work on memorizing notes on page 1 to 3. That's a much clearer goal both for ourselves and for our students. We know what we want to work on, and our students know what to expect in the rehearsal that day. Further, taking it outside of this, it's the idea of making specific steps towards that goal. We don't think to ourselves well, I want to save more money. That's not very clear. How are we going to do that? Instead, a more clear goal would be, I want to save $5 a week. In that way, we have a clear timeline, we have a clear amount, and we know exactly what we need to do to achieve those smaller steps. Challenging. So, this is important and also sometimes more difficult. To be motivating, goals must be a balance between challenging but not overwhelming. So, for instance, maybe something that would be too challenging would be to increase in recruitment and enrollment by 500% next year. I mean, maybe that's not too challenging for you. For me, that is going to be something that might not be very attainable. But too easy and also unclear is increase enrollment next year. Well, that's a great goal, but it's vague. We don't have a clear path forward. How do we know if we've achieved that? Just right. Increase enrollment by 10%. Now, this is hopefully a challenge, but it's clear. We know exactly what that measure of success is. Now, this is important. How do we get to that balance? We need to be honest with ourselves. As much as I'd love to increase my recruitment by 500%, I teach at a smaller school, 500% would be most of the school. That's not likely. But we also need to use scenario planning. What steps will it take to increase enrollment? What challenges may arise? Now, of course, we all know what challenges we're facing this fall, but how might things change? What challenges might we not be considering right now? So using really specific scenario planning can help us to reach that balance between challenging, too challenging, and just challenging enough. A goal that is seen as attainable but challenging is much more motivating. Task complexity. So for a goal to be motivating, it can't be too complex. So a good goal, you break down complex targets into sub-targets as opposed to setting a complex goal with no plan to achieve it. And we do this for our students every day, but sometimes we might not do this for ourselves. And if we feel overwhelmed as we're facing this fall, it might just be because our task is too complex and we haven't taken the time to break it down into sub-goals. So, for instance, one of my backup plans if we are unable to sing together at all and we move online, is for my choral students to be essentially a repertoire choir where we learn repertoire that we might not have the chance to learn otherwise. So a really complex goal for me, a too complex goal, would be I'm going to pick the perfect repertoire to teach my students the joys of music while we can't sing together. Well, that's a great goal, but it's a little too complex. How do I get there? And of course, it's unclear. So sub-targets might be, I will pick 6 pieces that my students can learn this semester that we might not otherwise have a chance to perform. I could break that down even further. One sub-target could be, I will pick a mixed choir piece with orchestra that we might not have a chance to perform. Another sub-target piece would be, I will pick from composers who are not frequently represented in our choral works. There are a lot of different ways we can add these sub-targets to move towards this idea of picking the perfect repertoire or a more complex task. So take the time to really identify the goals. Your goal might not be too much or too challenging. It might just be that we need to take the time to break it down into sub-targets. Feedback. So this is really important. Loth and Lakeham, in their research, they determined that consistent and honest feedback was really important for a goal to continue to be motivating, because frequently our goals are long-term. So for feedback to be effective, it must be clearly communicated. There must be a clearly communicated goal. So we have to know exactly what that goal is. The feedback must be regular, and both positive and negative feedback should be received. So this goes for ourselves and our students. Frequently, it's easier to give that feedback to our students, right? And we're talking about setting goals for ourselves as well as our students. So we can do weekly check-ins with our students. We can use spreadsheets to evaluate progress. Frequently, with my students, both in and out of the classroom, I find self-evaluations to be incredibly helpful. My students are so self-aware when they do self-evaluations. They often notice things that I have not noticed or would not expect them to be aware of. And they are very honest with themselves with the progress that they are or are not making. And I think you might find the same for ourselves. If we try to give ourselves really honest self-evaluations, we can probably determine a lot of this feedback ourselves. And now for everyone's favorite, recordings. Recordings are such an important way to give ourselves and our students feedback. Recordings are not biased, they're very honest, and they will give us positive and negative feedback. Recording our rehearsals or our Zoom sessions and looking back at them later can be incredibly helpful for us to notice how we are making progress towards our goals, how we might not be making progress, and how we need to adapt. Sometimes it's easy to be a little distracted by other things in our recording, so it might be helpful to write down what goal you are evaluating for feedback when you're looking at these recordings to help you stay focused specifically on those goals. And then you can go back and watch it for other feedback and other input, but it's important to stay focused as we receive this feedback. So we've talked a little bit about how we're setting goals for ourselves as well for our groups. It's going to be a little bit different for groups than for ourselves. So for students, research shows that optimism when setting goals will have a significant impact on the success. So for instance, a student might think to themselves, I don't want to fail any classes this semester. But if they put that in a more optimistic way, I am going to pass 3 classes this semester. That optimistic framing can have a really important impact on how they reach that goal. We'll talk about that in a little bit. Agreement on team goals elicited greater contributions and task success, regardless of the difficulty of the goal. So this actually goes back to commitment and how to get a team involved in that commitment. The more a team can agree on the goals for that team, the more they will want to contribute, the more they will feel success. And this actually was found regardless of the difficulty, so the challenge of that goal. So if you can get your students all on board with one goal, it almost doesn't matter what that goal is, as long as, of course, it's working towards your larger goals. It's going to help them feel involved, feel satisfied when they achieve it, and it doesn't really matter what that difficulty is, as long as they're all committed to it. So this is even more important with virtual teams. So much of what we do is face-to-face. A lot of what we do in the rehearsal atmosphere is developing these goals with our students, creating a common goal, teaching them to rely on each other, to rely on themselves. So when we move to a virtual model, that becomes more challenging. So the more that we can design our interactions that encourage them to make these goals together, the more we can recreate that as much as possible. And finally, adding in intermediate goals on the way to larger goals improves task performance. So this kind of gets back to task complexity, and we do this for our students every day. When I bring a piece to my students, I don't simply say, okay, get a performance ready. Of course, every rehearsal, we focus on intermediate goals. And so in that way, we need to break down goals for our students so that they create this idea of achievement as they move forward, and it maintains that motivational factor. So this is the idea of SMART F goal setting. So we'll talk about the F in a minute. So this has been around for a while, but it's really a guide for how to set effective goals kind of within that larger goal setting theory. So the first is that it's specific. So for instance, if I'm online, I don't just want more students engaged. Maybe I had 75% of my students engaged, and this year I'm thinking, well, I want more. I need to be specific. I want 80% of my students engaged, or 90. But then further, what does engaged look like to me? Does that mean that they are attending every class? Does that mean that they have turned in 100% of their assignments? And that takes us to the next aspect, and that is measurable. So I frequently take issue with the idea that we are measurable, right? We are in an art form. We don't always fit into a database or an Excel spreadsheet. But it's important that we know what our measure of success will be for how the goal is progressing. Maybe our measure of success is going to be getting that one difficult to reach student to really make progress this semester. Maybe our measure of success will be to get notes learned on this one difficult piece in 3 weeks. It's important that we know what that measure of success is so that we can accurately gauge how we are approaching it. Attainable. Is our goal realistic to the challenges we face? So this semester, I've had to cap my choirs, and I'm giving priority to majors and minors who need to progress towards their degree. So an unrealistic goal for me might be, I'm going to increase my enrollment. I'm going to double the size of my choral program next fall. That maybe won't be realistic. A more attainable goal for me might be, I am going to bring my choral program back up to the size that it was before COVID-19 by next fall. That's a goal that gives me a timeline. It's more realistic to the challenge that we're going to be facing this year, and it's specific, relevant. So this is important. We don't keep our students, we don't teach our students in a vacuum. They're experiencing a very changed world as well. So how can we make sure that our goals for them are relevant to the time that we're living in? And how does it serve the needs of our music and our program? So trying to make our goals as relevant to what's going on in the world right now as possible. So for instance, if I move online, we'll be working towards more of a repertoire choir. So ideally, it's keeping the needs of my students who need to progress as musicians and choral students. They'll be able to learn repertoire they might not be able to. But it also hopefully is keeping the needs of them being safe at home in mind. because that's an important goal too. Time bound. Give yourself a timeline. We have all have wonderful goals, but if we don't give ourselves really clear timelines, it's going to be difficult to achieve those. So think about what you want to achieve the first week or even the first meeting. Think about what we want to have achieved by the first month, by December. And now the last one, I added this, flexible. So the world is changing. Certainly we face different challenges now than we even faced in the spring. It might look very different in October. We might start face-to-face and then have to move online or vice versa. So really give yourself grace and allow your goals to adapt. So there are some things to remember. Goals are really great motivators unless there's a threat of negative consequences. So always, of course, we talk about positive reinforcement rather than negative. We use that for our students, but give that to yourself as well. We certainly don't want to consider ourselves a failure if we don't manage to achieve all of our goals in all the ways we thought possible. But as long as we can really look at what we have achieved, that's a great way to stay motivated. Goals can undermine each other if they are at cross purposes. If you have goals that are increasing your students' music reading, but also increasing maybe the ways that they are connecting with each other, it's important. Those aren't necessarily at cross purposes, but it's important to prioritize. And we do that every day in rehearsals. We don't look at every aspect of a piece of music all the same time. We prioritize. So it's important that we prioritize our goals in terms of time, which do we want to achieve first, and also in terms of importance at various points across the semester. If goals are deemed arbitrary or irrelevant, commitment is compromised. That goes for our students as well as ourselves. Our goals need to help us feel like we are still serving this purpose as teachers and educators and musicians. So make sure that your goals for this semester help you to do that, that you feel like you're still serving the needs of your students in the way that you want to. And achievement versus avoidance goals. So this is what we talked about a little bit before with positive language. Instead of thinking to yourself, oh gosh, I'm not going to lose more than 20% engagement, that's my goal, think to yourself, I'm going to have at least 80% of students engaged, or 100%, or whatever it might be for you. Think about it in a positive way. This has been shown to be really helpful for motivation and achievement. So finally, let your goals define your paint samples. We have this wonderful problem of having so many different ideas to examine, but it's easy to get overwhelmed. So take a step back first. Goal setting can be a really powerful motivator. They've shown that when setting goals, it really encourages us to look for new ways to achieve those goals. These really go hand in hand. The new techniques and the really clear goals make each other much more effective. Our goals for ourselves and our students should be clear, challenging, explicitly committed to. They should involve regular feedback, and they should be as uncomplicated as possible. If you keep these things in mind when you're making your goals, it will help you to be motivated, it'll help your students to be motivated, and it'll help you and your students to achieve these goals. So think about your goals, write them down. It might be around 3 goals. That might be a good goal. You might have a short-term goal, a medium-term goal, and a long-term goal. That's a good general area, but maybe you want more. Maybe you want fewer. But regardless, it's really important to revise and reassess often. Sit with your goals. See if they are as clear as you can make them. See if you're really committed to them. Write them down again. See which ones rise to the top for you. So here are some resources that I found useful. You might be interested in them if you're wanting to learn more about these concepts. Ideally, we can use goal setting as a tool to be the most effective teachers and musicians and educators that we can be this fall. So hopefully something in that is helpful or a tip becomes useful as we approach this changing year. Ideally, we will all have clear, successful, achievable goals for ourselves and our students. We are all committed to making this a year that is not just surviving, but thriving for ourselves and our programs and our students. I'm excited to talk to you about your questions. Thank you so much for coming.